Right now, I have other breaking news, and I want to tell you what it is. President Trump's new Attorney General, Bill Barr, has announced, of course, that Bob Mueller could finish his probe as soon as this week that we're in. And there are these new signs. The congressional leaders actually think the Trump administration might bury Mueller's findings today. Powerful chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, which, of course, oversees DOJ and handles potential impeachment. He says there are signs that Bill Barr and Rod Rosenstein are building a case to bury the findings. Now, we just spoke by phone, and Nadler is warning the DOJ against exploiting the now famous policy against indicting a president to potentially cover up what Mueller finds.
You take the position that the president cannot be indicted, no matter how much proof you have, and therefore we're not going to comment on whatever evidence we have, then you converted that rule, a normally good rule, into a cover-up. If you withhold that information from Congress, because you can't indict the president as a matter of law, then it's a huge cover-up.
That is from our discussion today. Chairman Nadler told me a few other interesting things about why he says his new probe of Trump corruption has to be broader than Mueller. I'm going to play you that statement as news in a moment. I also want to tell you the whole push comes as House Democrats are using their power to force a floor vote as soon as next week on releasing the Mueller report. Now, that matters because Democrats would then be forcing Republicans to get on the record about transparency, raising the question, if Mueller doesn't have anything damning against Donald Trump, this is what I want to emphasize here. The question that would be raised by that vote on the House floor is if they have nothing against Trump, why wouldn't you want to release the Mueller report? So to get into all this, I want to bring back DOJ official Matt Miller and reporter David Korn, part of our broader coverage as well. Matt, what do you think of what Chairman Nadler told me there regarding why some of this should become public?
I think he's exactly right. Look, we've seen the president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, use this DOJ opinion that a sitting president can't be indicted as a shield, really, for the last year or so. He's been out talking about it and using it as a way to protect the president. But the flip side of that is that same shield becomes a sword for Congress, in that they can, if it's true, as DOJ says, that the Justice Department is not the arbiter of presidential conduct or presidential misconduct, but that Congress is, then what that means is that Congress should have access to every piece of evidence that the Justice Department has regarding the president's behavior. And I think that means not just the Mueller report, but all of the underlying evidence, all of the records of interviews with witnesses. It means that the Congress ought to be able to get access to testimony, either from witnesses, potentially from the FBI agents, and maybe Mueller, who conducted that investigation. And there is no good reason to keep that information from Congress. And in fact, doing so would be essentially putting the president above the law. I don't know if the Justice Department is going to willingly turn that evidence over, but I think that the chairman has a very good argument in the court of public opinion and also in the actual courts should the Justice Department resist and he has to go to court to try to enforce a subpoena.
David, this is part of a conversation I just had with the chairman. We're airing it for the first time. Take a listen to another point he raised in our discussion. What is your committee's message to individuals who don't furnish these documents?
Well, if they don't furnish the documents, and we think the documents are necessary, which we do, otherwise we would not have issued the request. For any individuals who think they don't need to respond, we have compulsory process. We can and will use subpoenas if we have to.
David, that's clearly a marker, and it comes with him emphasizing that they want to be broader than Mueller. That's deliberate.
Well, yeah, Robert Mueller has a very specific job. His job is to look for crimes and prosecute the cases that he thinks he has a reasonable chance of winning. It's, not his job to investigate everything, to do a big expansive report at the end, to tell the American public what really happened in the Trump-Russia investigation or with anything else that involves corruption and the Trump circle. So what Jerry Nadler, I think, is rightfully doing, what Adam Schiff is doing in the House Intelligence Committee, is saying we need to tell the public what happened, whether it was criminal or not. There still can be wrongdoing that's not a crime that you prosecute. And so for that, you need to have a pretty wide angle lens to sort of see what's out there. And there may be things that happen on the Trump campaign. There may be interactions with Russia that were not illegal, but still were very wrong and could be even considered acts of betrayal on the part of the Trump camp. And of course, they're looking at a lot more beyond the Trump-Russia. You have emoluments, you have nepotism, the clearances with Jared Kushner and improper action there that goes to the Oversight Committee as well. There's just a lot of stuff to look at. It's amazing. Trump has only been in office 2 years, and he's generated, 12 different investigations that each could take a year to do appropriately.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any debate about how many targets there can be. The other thing, Matt, that gets into the type of nitty-gritty of DOJ policy that I don't think you or I would have ever thought would be national news, 5 or 10 years ago, and now is everyone's an expert on the Office of Legal Counsel rules about not indicting a president. And everyone has become an expert, or at least is familiar with the idea that, well, wait a minute, there are different rules for prosecutors in general about what they can say when they don't indict. But Chairman Nadler said something else really interesting today that I think other people have talked about. I know you've talked about. And we want to play for you a bit of Rosenstein and Barr, both making this more broad point about why prosecutors are supposed to be tight-lipped. Take a look. Do we have it at all? We may have it in a second.
Making allegations against American citizens.
The rules, I think, say that the independent, the special counsel will prepare a summary report on any prosecutive or declination decisions, and that shall be confidential.
As boring as Barr makes it sound, it's the most interesting thing to a lot of people in the world. Declination being, if they don't charge people, are we going to learn about it? So I want to, again, with that context, Matt, take a listen to what Chairman Nadler just told me, citing that and saying why he's concerned.
Barr said this, and Rosenstein repeated it, and they both said that, it's Department of Justice guidelines, Department of Justice practice, that you don't comment on the conduct of someone who is not indicted.
He said he views that negatively because this is a case where the rules would support something else, especially if it involves the president. Do you think he has the better side of that argument, Matt?
I do. Look, the Justice Department rules basically boil down to one thing: indict or shut up. If you can't make a case, if you're not willing to make a case in court by indicting someone, be quiet. And that's the problem it's the mistake that Jim Comey made with Hillary Clinton. He didn't recommend indicting, but he didn't shut up. He talked about it.
I'm going to let you finish, but to be fair, it's a legal and mathematical fact that James Comey never makes mistakes.
According to James Comey,
I know that. I read his book, and that was one of the themes of the book.
That is very, very much true. And I think, with respect to, let's say Donald Trump Jr., if the Justice Department finds that it can't indict Donald Trump Jr., I don't think it should put out a report characterizing his conduct because they've decided they can't indict him. They ought to shut up. But the president is very different. By the Justice Department's own definition, they can't indict him. So the usual rules of indict or shut up don't apply. I think what it means is if you can't indict, you have to give the evidence to the body of government, the entity of government that by the Justice Department itself says is the arbiter of presidential conduct. So that gets to the point we made a minute ago. It means at the end of this, they're not going to indict the president. Whether they think he committed a crime or not, they need to turn the evidence over to Congress because their standard is different. It's not whether he committed a crime. It's high crimes and misdemeanors, which isn't necessarily a higher standard. It's not necessarily a lower standard. It's a different standard informed by both legal and political questions. But it's a call for Congress to make, and they can't make that call without seeing all of the evidence.
And Ari, if I could just
briefly, because I got some other news, but briefly, go ahead.
Chime in here. So if you take Matt's example of them looking at Donald Trump Jr. and not bringing a case forward, maybe they found out that Donald Trump Jr. had some communications with Russia that signaled to Russia, go ahead and intervene, the campaign won't matter, and they just decided it doesn't actually violate a law. So they're not going to tell us. That's where you need Congress. That's where you need an independent commission to investigate those aspects and tell the public, because crime or not, the public deserves the right to know.
My special thanks to Matt Miller and David Corn. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.